Thanks, Elise. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us on Monday afternoon. We're going to talk today about auto-redaction and workflow rules. And as Elise said, I encourage questions, especially if something I said wasn't clear or you have a specific circumstance that you want to ask about. By all means, please do so. Hopefully you're seeing my screen. It says auto-redaction and workflow rules. If you don't see that, let Elise know. All right, so let's just dive in there. The webinar topic today is part of a broader sequence on specialty eDiscovery. That is an area where Valora has a lot of activity. And so I'm often asked, what do we mean by that? So I'm going to define that here. We're talking about pretty much everything but email going into K-Cura's relativity. If that is your typical environment, that's probably not specialty eDiscovery. We'd call that maybe more run-of-the-mill eDiscovery. We're a little bit talking about everything else that would not count as that. And so this is our kind of growing list of specialty eDiscovery. Again, everything sort of but the email. Today we're going to be focusing on auto-redaction and the related workflow that goes with it, and you tend to see that in these kinds of materials, in this kind of avenue of specialty eDiscovery. And so let's start with just a simple definition of what do we mean by auto-redaction. Redaction, in case anyone does not know, is the systematic blocking out of sensitive or offending text. It can be done on a piece of paper with a black marker. That is the old style redaction, well known to many, I'm sure. Today, a more kind of digital approach to that is to use a mouse to do click and drag a black box. Very similar to the marker in the sense that it is a human being doing the work, redaction by redaction. That is not what we mean when we say auto-redaction. Auto-redaction is software actually performing the redaction steps. So it is making the black bar, or we'll get into other forms of redaction, but the black bar on the page automatically by parsing, which is kind of a fancy computer speak term for understanding and knowing what a document says. So the software is performing the redaction. When I talk about auto-redaction, that's what I mean. I mean an algorithmic, automatic approach to redaction. There's lots of different types of redaction presentation. Everybody is familiar with the black bar. I'm going to show you a whole bunch of different choices that you might want to use in different circumstances, sometimes even on the same document. And it is available for pretty much any kind of possible information that you would want to redact. Most people are familiar with PII, which is personally identifiable information. Those are the ones down here, social security number, date of birth, that kind of stuff. But there are lots of other types of information that you might want to redact, particularly in a discovery scenario. We're going to talk about some of those as we move through. And one of the nice things about auto-redaction is, like all sort of automated technologies, it can be applied as much as necessary and as quickly as necessary. Typically auto-redaction systems don't have to take coffee breaks or go home at night or get sick or any of that. It really is software doing the work. So you can kind of have an unlimited array of redactions in a population or even in a single document that would be kind of complex and cumbersome for a human being to handle. It's one of the advantages of using automation. So just in case anyone is still confused what we mean by redaction, there you go. Okay, so what kinds of redaction might make sense? I just showed you a simple black bar where the text is literally covered by a black bar. You can have a variant of that where, well, in the first one up here where it says black bar, the text is actually removed and substituted with a black, essentially piece of the area of the page covered with blackness, and the text is removed. You can have a variant on that theme. I lost my mouse. Here we go. Where it's actually clickable. So it looks black unless you know to click. That's a fun one. I kind of like it. It's that sort of like secret code. You can have substitute text. A lot of legal scenarios will use something like this. You can use a generic phrase like content intentionally removed, or you can use substitute text. So for example, if under here, let's say, was a minor's date of birth, something very highly sensitive you would not want to produce, you could just say minor's date of birth. Actually use that phrase, which in itself is not any kind of sensitive information. It's just giving slight detail on what's below the redaction. Again, with automated redaction, you can do this kind of substitution thing. So let's say if you have 6 or 8 redactions on a page, you can kind of use these helper phrases on top of the redaction itself that gives you information but not sensitive information. So it's substantive but not sensitive, and therefore it could be produced or utilized. Because it's software, you can kind of have any color you want. You want gray, black, blue, purple. It doesn't really matter. You can have that text be showing through underneath. You can have it substituted. And this is where we'll get into some of the workflow rules. You can even have different colors for different purposes. Let's say you were redacting for sensitive information or PII as well as trade secrets. So you might want the trade secrets to be in pink and the PII to be in yellow. Anything is possible. It's kind of a computerized world, so take your pick. The last one on here becomes very useful if you are exchanging native files back and forth with the other party, where the content itself is actually removed. Just as a case in point, Valora worked on a matter where select information was pulled out of select cells in an Excel worksheet. And just literally the cell data was removed for the offending content, and the rest of the documents kept intact. And so that's another trick. That's a little bit tough to do with a black marker, obviously, but it works very well in software. One thing to consider if you guys are thinking about using auto redaction is whether or not you want to have someone approve or override the automation. Some clients want that. It gives them that extra layer of security, or that they can say they had eyes on all the redactions. It's certainly doable. And some other clients are perfectly happy either by letting the software just run or doing a sampling of the software's output and leaving it at that. All of those are perfectly viable. Okay, so what kinds of information can be auto-redacted? Obviously, PII. And we're going to talk about PII a little bit more in a minute. Financial information. People don't always realize that this is easy and good to redact. You might have things relating to a specific client or specific customer. There may be highly sensitive information that of a financial nature. One of the other areas where we see a need for redaction is when there's, let's say, a huge list of people, but only some of the people are party to the lawsuit, like as you might see in a class action. Again, case in point at Valora, a list of employee personnel inside an organization, and only some of them were in the class. So anybody not in the class, of course, has to be redacted out. That's a good application of auto redaction. Anything that might be of a sensitive nature, the secret formula for Coca-Cola or KFC, something like that. Any kind of identifying branding information might, want that redacted. Another thought for you all is that I'm using the word redaction, but it can actually be used also as a euphemism for highlighting. So if you want certain things in documents highlighted, not necessarily removed or blacked out, but just kind of brought to focus, the way you'd use, a yellow highlighter pen or a blue pen, you can do the same thing. You can have text pop out based on the same type of technology. I will call it auto redaction, but it really is also auto highlighting. Sometimes people will talk about hit highlighting, same concept. Here's just some additional types of information, and this was just a short list kind of off the top of my head. Pretty much anything that you can define can be redacted or highlighted. I'll point out this last one about locations and addresses. This is latitude, longitude. And this is kind of a blossoming area for redaction because of the increased use of cell phones and smartphones. Because it's very easy to identify where somebody is or where they were when they read an email or sent a text or something like that. So a lot of location information is kind of joining the PII fray because you can actually pinpoint where somebody was at a certain time. If you can hook that up with a CCTV, you can figure out who they are. So watch for more of this appearing in legal documents and being an issue that needs to be addressed because it becomes an identifiable piece of data. And then finally, this is a little bit more along the highlighting issue. Concepts and issues can also be redacted. It doesn't have to literally be, let's say, a social security number. It can also be, let's say it's an email and it's two people talking about strategic plans, or it's attorney-client talking about something about the case, and so it's privileged, but maybe not the whole document's privileged. So you can kind of pinpoint content based on the conceptual discussion and just redact out the sensitive information while the rest of it remains intact. We're seeing a lot more call for that as well. I think the days of, well, here's a 3-page document, there's 2 lines of sensitive information, so we'll just declare the whole document privileged. That, I think, is going to start going away. That section might be privileged and needs to be redacted, but the rest of the document will need to be produced. We're seeing that more and more, and that's where this kind of notion of redacting against concept comes into play. The best bets for auto redaction are things that are either formulaic, so something like a social security number, which is 3-2-4 digits, or credit card info, again, very formulaic number sequence. Those are going to perform super well, really, really strong. Honestly, there's no reason anyone should be doing those by hand at all. There, I've said it. Similarly, lists of information. Here's a list of all our car models from 2013. Something like that is going to auto-redact very, very strongly. Again, almost no need at all to do that kind of work by hand. The hardest one to make successful with auto-redaction is the concepts and issues, and that is because people have oblique ways of communicating sometimes. That is going to require a little bit more iteration, a little bit more almost like a predictive coding or a TAR workflow, but still very doable with auto-redaction, particularly if the parties are aware of kind of how people speak or how people communicate about the issues that you're looking to redact. If at least somebody in the mix is familiar with the kind of the ways and the approaches that the information is discussed, then it's a fine fit for auto redaction as well. And just to continue on the kind of the technology assisted review theme, just like that has kind of an iterative approach, auto redaction can too. There's no reason you can't run a population through auto redaction multiple times with different assumptions or different rules in play to see what the yield is. Redaction's a little bit more strict, particularly around PII. I mean, you really do have to redact all the PII. But if you're getting into highlighting and concepts and issues in that, that's when you might want to sort of play test a couple different rounds and see what the yield is before you produce and pick the one that you like better. I'll stop there and see if we have any questions. We kind of covered a lot of ground on so far what auto redaction is. Elise, any questions so far? Yes, that's an excellent question, and it is absolutely doable. It's something that we do frequently is just redact the last 4 digits of an SSN, or like on a street address, just the street, but leave the city or the town. On a zip +4, we'll sometimes just take out the +4 because the zip is a larger area and therefore not really personally identifiable, whereas the +4 can be a unique residence. So that happens all the time. It's very common and it's very doable with auto redaction. One of the nice things is that you can really dictate the form that the redaction will take. So I talked about, is it black, is it yellow, is it see-through, is it not? You can also, I mean, if you want it to be a star instead of a rectangle, you could do that. And you can also restrict, I want X amount of whatever's being redacted to still be showing. So it's an excellent question and absolutely doable. All right, great, good. These are good questions. Let's keep going. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more in detail. What does she keep talking about? Checking out these acronyms. So PII, most people have heard of it, unfortunately, these days because of all the data breaches that have been going on. And PII is the biggie, 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 because this is the one that generally we are legally required to protect. And so PII is literally, this is the literal government's definition, and it's basically information that can be used either on its own or with other information, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, to basically identify or locate a single person. That's why I mentioned earlier about the location, longitude, latitude, that kind of thing, because that is starting to become a hotter issue, as is triangulating across different data sets. I'm going to show you that in a moment. PHI is very similar, except it is health related. So anything about your medical background, your lab results, the fact that you saw a doctor, who the doctor is, what the ailment or whatever the resulting medical care, all of that is PHI, and obviously it really should be redacted. I'm not an attorney, so I can't tell you exactly when you need to redact information. I can tell you that it is becoming increasingly a big issue. Valora frequently gets the panic call of, oh my God, it turns out we have to redact all of this. And I think we're going to see more and more and more of that because as a society, we've been just a little bit too casual with all of this personal information. Perhaps we were a little bit too trusting. And it really is becoming not just a legal imperative, but also something of an ethical one to protect this kind of information because it's just too easy to steal. So these are the kinds of hot buttons. The last one is sensitive information, which sounds a little funny, what's sensitive? And what it really is referring to is things like trade secrets or classified information, a secret formula, a list of your most important competitors and your strategic plans to take them out one by one. In a more government setting, I think we do have some government folks on this call. Anything classified, of course, would be sensitive information and would need to be redacted accordingly. And yes, Valora's systems have been used to A, identify classified information, and then B, redact it out. Okay, so little quickie pop quiz just to make sure everybody's on the same page, just to understand which type of information we're talking about. All of them are auto-redactable. Just want to make sure you guys know in your head. So blood type would be a PHI for health information. Credit card number would be PII because I can identify whose credit card that is. Secret formula would be sensitive information. Cell phone number can go a lot of different ways. Generally considered to be PII, although there's also a PHI application. Your home address, PII. The age of a minor is considered PII. And something you should know if you're ever dealing with documents that involve minors, there's an interesting problem with minors because there's the age they were when the document was created versus the age they are now at the time of the matter. And so sometimes you do need to redact it because whatever it was took place when they were a minor, and sometimes you don't because now they are no longer a minor, and that really is dependent on the case. Regardless, obviously it's all auto-redactable, and one of the fancy tricks that we do here at Valora is we do a little bit of math to figure out how old was the person, given their date of birth, whenever XYZ document, particularly if you're covering the span of a number of years, when XYZ document was created. Were they or were they not a minor at that moment? It's a little bit fancy math. It's not that difficult, subtraction. But applying that to the use of the redaction, yes, no. It can be a little bit clever, and these are some of the things that you have to take into account when you're dealing with minors. Just to finish up the pop quiz, an employee ID would generally be, believe it or not, be considered sensitive information, and that is because it is indicating that the person is an employee of whatever company. So it's from the standpoint of the company that the information, it's considered sensitive. A layoff list, something, internal strategy, something like that, that's definitely going to be considered sensitive information. Household income would be PII. And then finally, a patent application would be sensitive information, although as soon as the application is filed, it's public. So it ceases its SI status. So I hope everybody got that. I'll stop for a second in case anybody wants to quiz me or argue with me about my classifications, because sometimes people do. So I don't know, Elise, if anybody wants to take issue with my assignments. Okay. So this is the difference between presenting here and at ARMA. Okay, so where is PII likely to show up in your client's document population? It's not just everywhere, strewn everywhere. There are really kind of ringer document types where you'll see it. Okay, forms and applications, really, really common. Obviously, employee information, HR information. Supplier information. Very often suppliers have to indicate who are majority stockholders, where do they live, what kind of income do they derive from the entity. So in a surprising way, procurement tends to be a hotbed of PII. Same thing for customer information. Any organization that's tracking information on their clients, and honestly, who isn't, is going to have that kind of information. Of course, this is what we're talking about today. And then records retention. This is especially important because in the past, the laws were different. It was completely reasonable and expected for everyone to ask everyone else for their Social Security number. Once upon a time, everybody's driver's license number equaled your Social Security number. And again, as a society, we were just a little bit more lax or naive. So historical records, particularly those that are, let's say, prior to the year 2000, are pretty much running rampant with PII. So then we get to when should we perform redaction during eDiscovery? Because you have a couple of choices. You can do it sort of early on as part of your collection or culling or ECA efforts. There are some benefits to doing that because you can prevent accidental disclosure at the outset before the documents go through all of these paces that they're going to go before they're ultimately used in trial. Ideally, you would just simply store documents natively with their redactions, because that way you don't run any issues for any purpose, eDiscovery just being one of them. And you can essentially apply different redactions depending on different user access rights to your document management system. So if you have, let's say, a secretary who has a lower level of rights and responsibility and clearances, she sees a highly redacted document, where the head of HR, who of course has to be able to get at employee data, does not sees the same document but without the redactions. And these are some of the fancies involved in the application of the rules and the workflow for when to put a redaction on a document and when not. The alternative, of course, and this is what a lot of people do right now, is to perform redactions later during the doc review step. And the thinking goes something like this. I already have people looking at every document, so they might as well, while they're in there determining priv or marking issues, they should also just redact while they're in there. And on the one hand, that's true. You can combine all those together. On the other hand, that's a very laborious, expensive process that is going to just extend that number of contract attorney hours. And so while the thinking is, oh, well, I'll only have to do those docs that need it, ultimately this becomes a very, very expensive proposition. And so the answer really lies, of course, in the time and the cost of doing the redactions. Yes, if you're doing them by hand, you might as well do them at the end after the docs have been culled out to some degree. But if you're doing it with automation, then you want to do it at the automated steps. You want to do it at the outset while you're doing file processing, while you're doing culling, you might as well do your auto redaction right on in there at the same time and just have all your automated processes run at once. For those that are a little bit more on the information governance side of the equation, that is where the application is in that situation. InfoGov doesn't really have a concept of manual doc review usually, maybe a little bit of exception handling at the end of the day, but the bulk of the analysis and the application of these types of things are up here, kind of back at the ranch where the documents live natively. Okay. So let me show you a little bit about how auto redaction works. For those who don't know, Powerhouse is Valora's big auto processing platform. We've built this over a number of years. It does all kinds of fancy automation, and auto redaction is one of the things that it does. And so here's what happens. The documents come in, let's say, their native format. And so we will image and extract text for them. And then we will apply various types of recognition rules for sensitive information, or PII, and then literally apply the redactions onto the image, the text, and if needed, the native file. And these are really kind of up to the customer what their production mechanisms are and what they want to use for their own internal use. But this is literally what happens. Clients don't really ever see this taking place. They just sort of see the net result up in their hosted system, whether it's Valora's system or some other. So I'll stop there in the event that there are any questions, Elise. Yes, that's an easy one. Absolutely. It can be kind of anything you want in terms of visual presentation. The way that this is working in the background is that Powerhouse is applying a sophisticated set of pattern matching rules. So let's just say this first one, it is redacting out an address. And so you can have a rule that says when you redact out an address, make it blue. And maybe over here, I'm just making it up right now, but maybe there was a brand name or a product name. So if it's a product name, make it purple. Or what have you, or make every other line pink and purple, whatever it is you want. It's all pretty doable, and it's pretty clever visually to have different colors represent different rules, because you can look at a document instantly and see, if you see a whole bunch of blue, then you know there's a lot of product info on this document. And if you see a whole bunch of purple, you know it refers to minors, or whatever it is. It's just a nice visual cue, and it's very easy to do. We've been so brought up and trained to think of redaction equals black, but it really can equal anything, and if you're clever, you can really make good use of that. So here's how, oh, sorry. Yes, wow, what a good question. 10 points for that asker. Yes, absolutely. One of the things that Powerhouse does, just as almost as a regular deliverable, is create a report of all files and their status. So yes, you can say, you can essentially have a list of files that have redactions, and then you can have another column of why it was redacted. This was redacted because it was PII, or even more sensitive, PII date of birth, PII SSN. All of that is possible, and I'm really impressed with who asked that. There's a very good understanding of how a rules-based system works. And I should probably stress that's what Valora uses, a rules-based pattern matching. There are other systems that will attempt to be a little bit more like predictive coding, that is to mimic what a person is doing by hand. That's really not how Valora's works. It's literally using the rules and the pattern matching. And therefore, we can provide that last column of detail as to why the redaction was made. So 10 points to that asker. Okay, so let me show you a little bit sort of what it kind of feels like in a workflow. So here is a URL. If you've ever done any mortgage processing, you know what this is. Or if you've ever applied for a mortgage, you know what this is. This is just a standard document, which I really hope all the information is false because I just pulled it randomly off the internet. And I really hope that these are made up people. But you can see that there's sort of PII all over the place on this document. There's social security numbers, there's home addresses, there's obviously their names. Okay, the names itself aren't necessarily a PII, and that's why I say by a warning sign. We're going to get into some of the nuances now of PII. Names by themselves aren't a PII, but because they exist with date of birth and social security number, now it is. So while there were originally, when I first looked at it, they were sort of what I would call slam dunk PII, like date of birth or social security number. The fact that their name is connected to these now makes their name PII as well. So here's more. People sometimes ask about this. Is the fact that there's an interest rate on here PII? And the answer is no. It's literally just an interest rate. And even if you know that that is Brady and Wilma's interest rate, that's not really considered PII, and I just give that as a counterexample. Okay, and so if we were classifying this document, let alone redacting it, we would classify this as saying there's active PII on this document. It needs protection, it needs redaction. And so all the offending material will get redacted out. And I'll show you a little bit what that looks like in Powerhouse. So this is a different document, okay, just so nobody's wondering. So here is Powerhouse with things redacted out on the image. That's the image down here. This, by the way, is our QCUI screen. It's literally what our QC team sees. You'll see there's multiple redactions going on. This yellow has been made see-through so that we can see through it. And what that is sort of a suggested redaction. The QCer can say, yes, go ahead and make that redact or not. And again, this is just inside the Powerhouse environment here at Valora. You can see different things redacted out for different purposes. And so we call the autocoder or the rules has already done this, and then the QCer can overwrite this. In this case, I suspect we have the version where they can click this and the information will shine through. I just have a screenshot, so I can't show you that right now. But this is a little bit how any kind of QC works at Valora, just a little window into that with a redaction lens. Okay, so I kind of hinted at this earlier, this notion of context, because there's a lot of confusion about PII, and pretty much everybody's doing it wrong. There are people that are over-redacting because they're absolutely terrified that everything they have is PII. And then there are people that are way under-redacting on the theory of, well, nobody asked for redaction, so I must be okay. That's not really true. Anytime you are dealing with PII, you really do need to redact it. I mean, technically, you are disclosing private information, and you are responsible for that. So anybody that's a producing party here, take note of that. So this is why I want to get into the context. So suppose there's a document like this, okay? This is a document that's literally listing date of birth and age. There's nothing here that says that this date of birth, simply because it exists, is PII. It's not. You don't know who was born 4/26/1978. There is no way to tell that from this document. So technically, this is not PII as it stands. So clients often think like, oh my God, there's dates of birth, we have to redact everything. That's not true. It really does depend what other, I call it triangulating, because the same way like satellites can determine where your cell phone is because there are 3 different satellites. That's why it's called triangulating. Okay, you can do the same thing with data. If you have 3 data points that corroborate each other, you can triangulate and pinpoint the PII. That's why you need to look at documents as a population and not singly. Because any kind of software like Valora's that is aware of the other documents in the population and can literally data mine or data triangulate through the population can do this kind of analysis. So suppose this is a document in, the first custodian, And here's a document in the second custodian. Okay, same info. These are the same exact two columns, but now they have names on them. Okay, now this is PII, and therefore so is the first one, because I can triangulate from one document to the next, and I can literally almost go back in time and figure out the PII to this first set. And this is some of the nuance and some of the difficulty in working with PII that people really have not understood just yet. This is why you want to get an expert on your team who really understands PII and whether or not you're going to get caught. Just so people know, I said date of birth is not always a ringer. It depends what else is there. That's correct. SSN is always a ringer. You can just literally have a page, a blank page with nothing but an SSN on it, and it's PII. Because an SSN always refers to a unique individual. Everybody knows that, and you can go find that out. So SSN is the killer for PII. Okay, well, we kind of talked about that. All right. So when does PII become a problem? As I said, the existence of PII isn't a problem per se. It's what happens when you do it. Are you allowing other people to see it? Are you producing it to another party? Are you using it for some kind of analysis? Are you opening it up to other people to see it? That's when it becomes a problem, when it is exposed or evaluated or produced. What I try to do is talk with groups and say, in order to best understand PII, even though we know this will never happen to you, what would happen in a data breach? Do you know what would be exposed? Do you know what you have? And how quickly could you recover? And that is something that honestly is not discussed enough in an eDiscovery context. The assumption is that everybody's operating above board, and everybody's an attorney, and everybody's therefore obliged to be ethical. The greater your contract attorney army that is reviewing documents, the more risk exposure you have. And so, again, what Valora would advocate is to apply your redactions earlier in the process so that you mitigate either accidental or intentional disclosure. And the way to really evaluate the potential risk is to ask yourself or ask your client this question. And just in case they or you think you are immune, this is my ridiculously out-of-date slide from 2014, because I've been afraid to look at 2015. These are data breaches in 2014. The number one cause of breaches, hacking, and every 3 seconds there's a new victim. That was in 2014. It has only gotten worse. If you want to go check it out for yourself, you too can go to the Identity Theft Resource Center. It's an open website, and they will report on anything you could ever want to know, and you will never sleep again, just so you know. So why bother with all this auto redaction? It looks nifty, it looks cool, you can do lots of different things that you just don't have the time or energy or money to do with magic markers. The real number one reason is the cost-effective nature. You cannot possibly compare software running 10,000 documents an hour to a room full of contract attorneys. I mean, it's just apples and oranges. What's interesting and what people don't often want to admit is that the software is often more accurate. We've seen this time and time again with technology-assisted review. We've seen it with issue coding. We've seen it with doc breaking or unitization. And we see it again and again with redaction as well. So watch for there to be more studies about the accuracy of automated redaction versus human redaction. It's all the same story all over again. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it is probably 1/10 the cost of doing it by hand. We've talked a lot about accidental disclosure, obviously. Typically, auto-redacted text or the result of the auto-redaction effort, that is text that has had the offending material removed, is still strong enough to do all kinds of subsequent auto-processing. So whether it's going to be auto-coding or rules or priv review or different types of classification, they can all come after the redaction and still work just fine. So it's a nice kind of double or triple play to go right from auto-redaction into some of these other technologies. The speed, I kind of alluded to that earlier. If things need to be redacted quickly, of course there's no contest. Software is going to run rings around a manual effort in doing so. The other thing that's nice is that your stronger automated systems will have a confidence level associated with their tagging or their redaction. So for example, Powerhouse knows when it has a strong slam dunk, this is definitely a social security number, I can definitely redact this, versus, ooh, I'm not sure, there's some counter evidence here, maybe it isn't. It's sort of tracking that information and its confidence level and reporting that back, so that you can look at the documents and say anything, below a certain confidence threshold, we're going to put through a manual process, we're going to do with exception handling and have somebody look at. So again, the better systems can tell you which ones really don't need eyes on and which ones do. So you kind of get the best of both worlds with that. And again, I mentioned this earlier, really the ideal place to perform redaction is much, much earlier in the chain of events, along with ECA and OCR and file processing. You want it to occur up at that level because it kind of covers out the chain from there on out in terms of exposure, and it can always be reevaluated at some sort of later stage. Just to note, though, it's not perfect. People aren't perfect either. I hate to say that because people get offended by that, but it's true. The software is not perfect either. There will be some errors. In other words, it picks the wrong thing. You can fool an automated system. Here's an example. I'll tell you how to do it. You could say, oh, if only my social security number were 123-45-6789. Okay, that's going to probably fool it a little bit, and that would be an error. And there may also be omissions. Omissions tend to come not really from the software kind of making a mistake. Usually an omission error is from the kind of the native or the original document had some sort of issue with it. Maybe it was a scanned document, it was scanned badly. Therefore the OCR is weak. Or maybe there was a user error in the creation of that document and they left a number off. That happens. People make mistakes. And so the software is looking for a pattern and it sees it's missing, it's off by a number. Or people put the wrong year. I'm still occasionally writing 2015 or something like that. The software, of course, is going to pick that up and say 2015. So that's where you tend to see errors and omissions. They're generally easy to spot, and they're generally, well, they are, by definition, they are repeatable. So, and that's one of the nice things about editing these types of systems. So if it has made an error, it will make the error the same way every single time. You find one instance of the error and you fix it and you fix them all. So that's just a hallmark of all these kind of automated systems, redaction included. Okay, so what do I need to do to make this happen? This is what Valora suggests as a workflow process for auto redaction and frankly any kind of automation. Oh, Elise, you have questions. I'll stop. Go ahead. Yes, that is something that Valora does for every single thing that we offer. It's absolutely built into our system. We're pretty much sampling all day, every day. It's how we determine that our templates and our processing are correct, and it's how we ensure that we have a high quality output before we ship it back out at the end. So we are pretty much sampling all day long throughout the entire process. What else you got, Elise? Oh, okay. All right. So I'll proceed with what we sort of suggest as a typical workflow process. This is a little bit eDiscovery oriented, but it does apply on the information governance side as well. So the first step to that is what we call document intake and submission. That is how the documents get to Valora in the first place. There's a lot of different options. Once they arrive and they come into Powerhouse, of course, everything is logged and all kinds of tracking. And then we get into the fun stuff, all the automation. Once things are kind of loaded, PHs for Powerhouse, once they're kind of loaded in and we pre-process, that's where we would do redaction right up front so that we minimize the risk and the exposure of that sensitive information. So we're going to make sure that that's clean, that it's perfect, and then move on to the additional steps. We usually will have 2 manual steps in our processing. One of them is here, where we're evaluating the auto LDD, that's unitization. In this case, the auto redaction, and anything else that is automated, what we would call error handling. And then it goes on to kind of the final stages of automation, where we're doing auto coding rules, maybe different types of tar. And then if we are putting eyes on at the end, sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Depends on what we're doing and how strong the initial population is. Then that's when we put on the QC team, and then we get ready and ship things out. So this is pretty much Valora's kind of preferred workflow. You can see the automation throughout. All of it is also being tracked by Powerhouse itself. For those, I showed you the QC UI earlier, which is what these folks in here would see, as well as these folks, where they're looking at it sort of doc by doc. There's another view on Powerhouse called the Administrative Console, which is up at this level where it's watching the entire process and the entire sort of where is the entire population at any given moment, so that we can provide reporting. Somebody asked about that. That would happen here as part of export and delivery. So that's a little bit of a window into a sort of typical Valora workflow. You can see where redaction comes fairly early in the process. And just to kind of finish it off, I focused a little bit today on eDiscovery because that's our series right now, Specialty eDiscovery. But Valora takes a very similar approach to all different kinds of document management problems, eDiscovery being one of them. The other big areas being records management, healthcare, and business intelligence. I'll give you a minute to look over that and see if there are any other questions. We have about 5 minutes left. Elise, anything else come through? Uh, I would say that depends on the client. In general, I'll go back up to that slide for a minute. Valora is very engaged with our clients. That's in part to make sure that we are delivering what the client wants. And it is also to help disambiguate various things that happen in automated processing. When clients are used to a more manual workflow, there's a kind of this assumption that somebody smart down the line will figure it out, whatever it is. And in the case of software doing the algorithms, you do need to be a little bit more explicit, and we will ask a lot of questions. And so we're fairly engaged with our clients, particularly here and here at the 2 manual steps. Here we're going to ask questions about error handling, and here we're going to ask questions about tagging and coding. So that's when we tend to be most engaged with our clients. Not as such. Well, let me say it this way. We have used it to perform review where there was not also a team of contract attorneys. Our sort of preferred model is to literally do the doc review and then have the client, typically outside counsel, have their internal team performing the sampling and the auditing and making sure that everything comes out correctly. The idea is not so much that there would then be a giant contract attorney team after Valora has run. That's sort of overkill. So depending what you mean by managed review, we will certainly do review for our clients. If that's what you mean by managed review, then yeah, we do it all day long. If you mean, does this work in tandem with a group of contract attorneys, then no, that's a little bit redundant. So depending on the meaning of that. Is that it, Elise? Okay, well then let me just quickly finish this on out. For those who are still on, Valora really has 3 types of clients that we work with. Although we're certainly open to anybody who has large-scale document problems. And this is a little bit who we are. If you want to learn more about us, of course, take a look at our website, which is valoratech.com. This is a little bit the motto that we live by. I liked it when I saw it in Forbes. And thank you, everybody, for coming today. We really appreciate your time and your attendance. And we hope you'll give us some feedback about what you liked, what you didn't like, and what you'd like to learn more about. Thanks.